In early February 2025, the National Institutes of Health announced that all grants would be subject to a 15% cap on indirect cost rates. Although a federal court has halted the implementation of that order, the prospect of this significant reduction in funding looms large at U.S. research institutions. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm talking with Amar Kelkar, a physician at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Kelkar has written a perspective article about the potential effects of reducing coverage of indirect costs for medical research. Dr. Kelkar, how are indirect cost rates currently set, and how have those rates changed over time?
So indirect costs have traditionally been set as a negotiated rate between institutions and the federal government, and these rates differ from institution to institution based on their own specific needs, the size of the institution, and all the services that they provide to help support the research infrastructure of that institution. Now, this has changed over time. Historically, this started being covered sometime around or a little bit after the Second World War, as a lot of research was being transitioned from government labs to private or public institutions. And this has increased over time. So these rates started quite low and then increased till as high as sometimes 70% or higher by the late 20th century. And then, due to some well-publicized cases, part of those rates were actually negotiated down in the early 90s, bringing the rates, specifically rates for administrative services, down to 26%, but still allowing for other indirect costs to be included in those grants. And so in the modern era, indirect costs are usually somewhere around 38 to 39% of these grants.
So you talked about institutional needs and services provided. How, in fact, do research institutions use this indirect funding from the NIH?
These indirect costs or indirect funds, which are also called facilities and administrative costs, are essentially overhead expenses that cover all sorts of support for the projects that are actually being completed by the researchers. So this can include the land itself in certain cases, laboratory space, utilities like electricity and water and internet services, more general utilities that you may not think of, like library services and ability to access research articles in their full form, maintenance of the buildings, administrative support staff for grant management, ethical compliance or other regulations, and a whole host of other things. And the reason that these costs are indirect are because they can't be tied to one specific grant. So, for example, you can't build one entire grant for the power bill or library services for a whole institution. And so these services have to be divided across multiple grants. And that's where that indirect concept comes from. And groups like the NIH and other federal agencies pay for these indirect costs because research can't happen without that underlying infrastructure. So both from safety, compliance with regulations like the IRB for human subjects and animal care and biosafety, disposal of waste, a whole number of other things, these costs really are essential to the effective administration and execution of research.
And then, can you describe the order that was issued in February? What changes would it make to indirect funding, and what was the justification for those changes?
The order was actually directly from the director of the NIH. And what it did was it capped indirect costs, and this includes both those administrative fees as well as all the other negotiated parts of the indirect costs at 15%. Now, this is a dramatic drop from the numbers that we had mentioned earlier, which could be as high as 50 to 70%, depending on the institution, with an average of 38 to 39% across all grants. And so this really significantly hampers how much institutions will be able to execute these projects. And one concrete example of this might be that a 15% grant at, say, an institution like Harvard, where I'm at, might leave a shortfall of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in these support services. And ultimately, for smaller institutions or for places that have less economies of scale compared to bigger institutions like Harvard, this might significantly hamper their ability to support research scientists and to conduct effective research. I think that the way that they justified it was a concern that these indirect costs have been out of control and that they represent more of a slush fund that don't represent the actual research or the potential gains from that research in a meaningful way back to the government and to the public. I don't know that this is extremely well founded, but I think in an environment where there's a significant interest in cutting costs and reducing the overall federal budget, indirect costs where there isn't a clear direct spend on each individual item across multiple institutions is an easy place to see where there might be some reductions. And I do, to some extent, agree that there's probably some room for negotiation or improvement of these rates further. In the article, I did go into a little bit of some examples of where indirect costs might be reduced, particularly for reducing federal regulations on research that may be outdated or may be ineffective. But without those changes, I think what would happen is there'd be a huge gap in funding at every single institution that might limit their ability to hire new researchers, particularly early career researchers, and might prevent future breakthroughs.
How did research institutions respond to the release of this policy, and what steps would they take if it actually does go into effect?
So when this policy was first announced in February, research institutions, I think, across the country had different levels of alarm in response. The University of Michigan actually had published on their website an example of their indirect cost rate and the potential impacts on their research. Similarly, other institutions raised concerns either through the public media or directly to the government about what this might do in terms of limiting their ability to function. And several institutions over the last few months have gone through major purges in terms of letting go, particularly non-clinical administrative staff that help to administer these grants. And so we saw that, for instance, at Brigham and Women's here in Boston, and several institutions around the country have had to go through that as well.
So, finally, and more broadly, what would this kind of cut mean for research and development in the United States and for healthcare delivery in the United States?
So, as I alluded to, I think that there would be a dramatic change in how we conduct research in the US. Research in the US has relied on a public-private partnership in some sense, that a lot of the core research in the US is conducted at public or private institutions funded primarily by public grants that set the stage for many future breakthroughs when these are taken into clinical trials downstream, often by private companies. And so that relationship is critical to all the new medications, say the GLP-1 receptor agonists that have dramatically changed the weight loss scene, or a new gene or cell therapies, or a whole number of things that have come up in the last decade alone. One number I saw cited by the NIH was that over 99% of new FDA approvals between 2010 and 2019 were based on research that came from the NIH, which is astounding and speaks to the fact that this sort of change from the NIH would completely upend how we currently do research and potentially limit new medications or therapies that might help improve human health.
Thank you, Dr. Kelkar.